The fastest way to discover how much someone truly respects you is to watch how they treat you when they believe you have absolutely nothing to offer them. The first thing Ava Monroe noticed when she stepped inside the Blackwell estate was the silence. Not the absence of noise, the absence of welcome. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the massive ballroom, while politicians, executives, and social elites drifted through conversations worth millions of dollars. A live orchestra played softly near the marble staircase. Expensive perfume mixed with the scent of imported roses. Everything looked perfect. Everything looked elegant. Everything looked cold. Ava adjusted the sleeve of her emerald maternity gown and placed a protective hand over her 6 month pregnant stomach. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration. Her husband, Ethan Blackwell, had just been named the future CEO of Blackwell International. The entire family had gathered to honor him. But from the moment Ava entered the mansion, she felt like an unwanted guest at someone else's party. You actually wore that? The voice came before the smile. Margaret Blackwell, Ethan's mother, a woman who had spent 3 years making Ava feel like she never quite belonged. Margaret's eyes moved slowly across Ava's dress. The judgment was immediate, hid beneath polished manners. Oh, sweetheart, Margaret said lightly. I thought Ethan would have explained the dress code. Several women nearby glanced toward Ava, then quickly looked away. The humiliation was subtle. That made it worse. Ava forced a smile. Ethan helped me choose it. For a brief second, Margaret looked surprised. Then she laughed softly. Well, men don't always understand these things. A few guests chuckled politely. Ava felt her face grow warm. Across the room, Ethan noticed, and just like always, he said nothing, not because he agreed, because confronting his mother made him uncomfortable, and Ethan hated discomfort. Mom doesn't mean anything by it, he whispered later. Ava stared at him. 3 years. 3 years of hearing the same sentence. Mom doesn't mean anything by it. Mom is old fashioned. Mom is stressed. Mom didn't mean it that way. Excuse after excuse. Excuse. Meanwhile, the cuts kept getting deeper. Near the champagne fountain, Ava noticed an older man watching her. His name was Harold Bennett, the Blackwell family's longtime legal advisor. He had worked with the family for over 40 years. When Ava approached the refreshment table, Harold suddenly looked at the silver bracelet on her wrist. His expression changed immediately. Ava, his voice sounded strangely emotional. Where did you get that bracelet? Ava looked down. The bracelet was simple, nothing expensive, just an old silver piece with tiny blue stones. My father gave it to me. Harold's eyes widened. Your father? Ava nodded. Why? The old man stared at the bracelet for several long seconds. Then he whispered something that made Ava's heart stop. I haven't seen that symbol in almost 25 years. Ava frowned. What symbol? Harold pointed toward the small engraving hidden inside the bracelet, a tiny crown, and beneath it, a letter M. Harold looked genuinely shaken. Your father never told you. Told me what? Before he could answer, a familiar voice echoed through the ballroom. Attention, everyone. The orchestra stopped. Conversations faded. Ethan's grandfather slowly approached the stage, the founder of Blackwell International, the billionaire who built the empire. He smiled proudly. Tonight we celebrate the future of our family. Applause erupted. Camator flashes exploded. Ethan walked toward the stage. Ava tried smiling, tried feeling proud, but something felt wrong. Because, while everyone applauded Ethan, she couldn't stop thinking about Harold's reaction, the bracelet, the symbol, the strange fear in his eyes. Then Harold stepped closer and quietly whispered, If your father is who I think he is, his voice trembled, then everyone in this room has made a very serious mistake. Ava froze. Across the ballroom, Margaret Blackwell continued entertaining guests, completely unaware that the entire evening was about to change forever. And somewhere outside the mansion gates, a line of black luxury vehicles had just arrived. Ava barely noticed the applause, filling the ballroom. Everyone's attention remained fixed on Ethan as he stood beside his grandfather beneath the massive crystal chandeliers. Future CEO, future Blackwell leader, future billionaire, the title seemed to make everyone smile. Everyone except Harold, the elderly attorney, stood motionless beside Ava, his eyes fixed toward the mansion entrance. His expression had changed completely. Almost nervous, almost afraid. Mr. Bennett, Ava whispered. What aren't you telling me? Before Harold could answer, the grand ballroom doors opened. The room didn't fall silent immediately. At first, only a few people noticed. Then more. and more. Conversations began fading one table at a time. Even the orchestra stopped playing. Something was happening. Everyone turned toward the entrance. Three black luxury sedans stood outside beneath the estate's massive stone archway. A tall silver haired man stepped from the first vehicle, Sybil navy suit. No bodyguards visible, no flashy jewelry, no performance. Yet somehow the atmosphere shifted the moment he appeared. People recognized power when they saw it. And this man carried it effortlessly. Ava felt her heart skip. Dad? Richard Monroe smiled warmly the moment he saw her. The tension in her chest instantly eased. Unlike almost everyone inside the Blackwell family, her father had never made her feel small, never made her earn his affection, never made her prove her worth. He simply loved her, the way parents should. Ah, Ava. He opened his arms. She hugged him immediately. The familiar scent of cedar wood and coffee brought unexpected comfort. You came. Richard kissed her forehead. Of course I came. His eyes drifted toward her stomach, then softened. And how's my favorite granddaughter? Ava laughed through tears. You don't even know if it's a girl. I know. He smiled. The room watched quietly. Margaret Blackwell approached first, her social instincts immediately activated. Mr. Monroe. Perfect smile, perfect posture, perfect manners. The same woman who had spent the last 3 years quietly insulting his daughter now suddenly sounded delighted to see him. What a lovely surprise. Richard nodded politely. Nothing more, no warmth, no enthusiasm, just courtesy. Margaret seemed confused. She wasn't accustomed to receiving neutral reactions. Most people worked very hard to impress wealthy families like hers. Richard didn't seem interested. Nearby investors exchanged curious looks. Something felt strange. Ava noticed it too. Then, Ethan's grandfather stepped forward, Charles Blackwell, founder of Blackwell International, the man worth nearly $4 billion. He extended his hand. Richard. Richard shook it calmly. Charles. The atmosphere tightened. Neither man smiled. Neither man looked particularly happy. For some reason, they seemed to know each other very well. You haven't attended one of our events in years, Charles observed. Richard nodded. I've been busy. The answer sounded simple, but something beneath it wasn't. Ava suddenly remembered something. Growing up, her father almost never discussed business, never bragged, never talked about money, never talked about influential friends. Nothing. She always assumed he simply owned a successful consulting company. That was it. But now, looking around the room, everyone seemed to know who he was. Everyone, except her. Harold stepped beside Richard. Good to see you again. Richard smiled genuinely. Harold, the old attorney, looked relieved. Still causing trouble? Richard laughed, only when necessary. Several investors exchanged nervous glances. Why did they suddenly look worried? Ava couldn't understand. Then, Ethan's grandfather cleared his throat. Ladies and gentlemen. The room focused on him again. As I was saying before our unexpected interruption, several guests chuckled politely. Charles continued. Tonight marks a historic moment for Blackwell International. More applause. We are preparing the largest expansion in company history. The giant presentation screen illuminated behind him. Charts, projections, growth forecasts, billion-dollar numbers filled the room. Investors nodded approvingly. Ethan stood proudly beside his grandfather, Fürster, king of the empire. Then Charles smiled. And pending final approval next month, the next slide appeared. A massive luxury resort development, international shipping ports, hospitality projects, real estate ventures, combined value 5.7 billion. The room erupted. Reporters immediately started taking photos. Investors applauded. Business leaders whispered excitedly. Then Ava noticed something strange. Richard wasn't clapping. Neither was Harold. In fact, both looked disappointed, as if they'd just confirmed something. Charles continued speaking confidently. The future has never looked brighter. Suddenly, Richard spoke. No. The single word echoed through the ballroom. Silence followed. Immediate calimpi clumped. Every head turned toward him. Charles Blackwell frowned. What did you say? Richard looked directly at the presentation screen, then at Charles, then at Ethan. The future has never looked riskier. A collective gasp moved through the room. Margaret looked horrified. Several executives froze. Charles' expression hardened. I'm sorry? Richard remained calm. Perfectly calm. The kind of calm powerful people possess when they know something others don't. Harold quietly closed his eyes, as if he knew exactly what was coming next. Richard folded his hands. You should tell them. Charles stared. Tell them what? Richard's gaze moved across the room. Investors, bankers, media, politicians, everyone. Then he spoke. The debt. Silence. Utter silence. Ava watched Ethan's face lose color instantly. Richard continued. The hidden financing. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The emergency restructuring. Margaret's smile vanished, completely, for the first time all evening. The Blackwell family looked afraid. Very afraid. And Ava realized something terrifying. Her father knew things about this empire. Things she didn't. Things most people in the room didn't. Things that could change everything. Then Richard looked toward Ethan, not cruelly, not angrily, disappointed. You remind me of your father. Ethan blinked. What? Richard sighed softly. A good man who spent too much time protecting appearances. The sentence hit harder than shouting ever could. Ava felt her stomach tighten, because it sounded exactly like something she had wanted to say for years. Charles interrupted immediately. This conversation is inappropriate. Richard smiled slightly. No. His eyes hardened. The timing is simply inconvenient. Across the ballroom, investors began checking their phones. Executives whispered urgently. Something was unraveling. Fast. Very fast. Then Charles made a mistake, a fatal one. His eyes drifted toward Ava, and he said, This isn't really your concern. The room became deadly quiet, because everyone understood who he meant. Ava. His granddaughter-in-law. The woman they had spent years treating like she didn't belong. Richard's expression changed. Instantly. The warmth disappeared. Every trace of it. For the first time that evening, Ava saw the man her father truly was. And suddenly she understood why powerful people seemed nervous around him. Because beneath his kindness lived something far more dangerous. Authority, abominable authority. Richard slowly reached into his jacket pocket, removed a leather folder, and placed it on the table. Actually, his voice remained calm. This concerns my daughter more than anyone in this room. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Harold looked down, almost sympathetically, because he already knew what was inside that folder, and judging by the fear spreading across Charles Blackwell's face, so did he. For several long seconds, nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody even seemed willing to breathe. The leather folder resting on the table suddenly looked heavier than gold. Charles Blackwell stared at it. His face had gone pale. Margaret noticed immediately, and that terrified her more than anything Richard had said all evening. Because Charles Blackwell never looked afraid, not during economic crashes, not during lawsuits, not during hostile takeovers. Never. Yet tonight, something inside that folder frightened him. Richard rested one hand on the folder, calm, controlled, the same way a chess player looks before making a move that ends the games. Ava watched him carefully. Her father looked completely different tonight, not because he had changed, because she was finally seeing him clearly. Richard, Charles spoke quietly. This isn't necessary. The sentence shocked the room. Not because of what he said, because Charles Blackwell was asking, not commanding, asking. Richard smiled faintly. I gave you 15 years. The room froze. Charles said nothing. Richard continued. 15 years to do the right thing. Ava frowned. What is he talking about? Nobody answered. Richard finally opened the folder. Inside were documents, contracts, legal agreements, old letters, records. Some looked decades old. Harold stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. They should know. Richard nodded. I agree. Then he looked directly at Ava, and everything changed. Sweetheart. His voice softened. There is something I should have told you a long time ago. Ava felt her heart begin to race. What? Richard looked toward Charles, then back at her. Blackwell International was never supposed to belong to the Blackwells. The room exploded. Gasps, whispers, confusion, shock. Every conversation started at once. What? Impossible. What does that mean? Charles immediately stood. That's enough. Richard ignored him completely. The company wasn't founded by Charles. Silence returned instantly. Ava blinked. What? Richard slowly removed an old photograph from the folder. The image looked at least 40 years old. Three men stood beside a shipping warehouse. Young, ambitious, hopeful. One of them was Charles. Another looked familiar, very familiar. Ava stared, then realization hit. Dad? Richard nodded. The second man was him, only younger, much younger. The third man Ava had never seen before. Richard looked at the photograph carefully, almost sadly. His name was Michael Monroe. Ava froze. Monroe. Her last name, her grandfather, the grandfather she never met, the grandfather who died before she was born. Richard swallowed hard. He was my father. The room remained silent. Nobody interrupted. Nobody dared. Richard continued. 40 years ago, my father and Charles built this company together. Every investor listened now. Every executive. Every reporter. Everyone. My father provided the capital. Another shockwave moved through the room. He financed the first ships. He purchased the first ports. He invested everything our family owned. Charles looked away. Richard's voice hardened. And when the company finally became profitable, silence. Charles cut him out. The room erupted again. Margaret stood immediately. That's ridiculous. Richard reached into the folder, produced another document. Signed ownership agreements. Harold took them, examined them, then nodded authentic. Very authentic. Several investors looked visibly nervous. Now, Ava felt dizzy. Everything she thought she knew about her family suddenly seemed incomplete. Richard wasn't finished. After my father died, he paused, the memory clearly painful. Charles promised he would honor the agreement. Charles finally spoke. It wasn't that simple. Richard looked at him. No, his voice became ice. It was exactly that simple. The ballroom fell silent again. Ava had never heard her father sound like this. Never Charles. Charles rubbed his forehead. A tired old man now. Not a billionaire. Not a king. Just an old man carrying old decisions. You disappeared. Richard laughed softly. No. His eyes hardened. You pushed us out. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Richard looked around the room. My mother spent years fighting legal battles. Boss. My father died believing his best friend betrayed him. My family lost everything. Ava felt tears forming because for the first time, she understood why her father worked so hard, why he never talked about money, why he never discussed business, why he built his own empire from nothing. Not ambition, pain. Richard continued. And while my mother worked 2 jobs, his voice cracked slightly, Charles became a billionaire. The room became painfully quiet. Even Margaret looked shaken now, because unlike social insults and family politics, documents didn't care about feelings. Facts were facts. Then Richard revealed the final truth, the truth nobody expected. I never sued. Several investors looked confused. Charles looked down, ashamed. Richard nodded. I could have. I had evidence. I had lawyers. I had every opportunity. He looked toward Ava. But my mother taught me something. His voice softened. Never build your future from bitterness. Ava felt tears running down her face. Richard smiled, sadly. So instead, I built something bigger. The room stared. What are you talking about? Richard looked toward the giant presentation screen, then toward the investors, then toward Charles. My company. The room became silent again. Several investors suddenly looked alarmed, because now they understood. They understood exactly who Richard Monroe was. One executive whispered, "Oh my God." Another finished the sentence. Monroe Global. Gasps erupted instantly. Ava blinked. Monroe Global? The company worth tens of billions. The company that owned ports across 3 continents? The company featured in business magazines? The company every investor wanted access to? That, Monroe Global? Richard nodded calmly. Yes. Nobody spoke. Nobody could, because the man they thought was merely Ava's father was actually one of the most powerful businessmen on earth. Margaret nearly sat back down, stunned. For 3 years, she had mocked Ava, belittled Ava, humiliated Ava, all while completely unaware that Ava came from a family wealthier than her own, far wealthier. Richard looked toward Charles. I never wanted revenge. His voice remained calm. I wanted peace. Then he looked around the ballroom. But tonight I watched my daughter spend hours being treated like she wasn't good enough. His eyes drifted toward Ethan. And I watched her husband do nothing. Ethan lowered his head, the shame visible, painfully visible. Richard continued. I could forgive business betrayal. His voice quiet. I could forgive old mistakes. Silence. But I won't forgive anyone who teaches my future grandchild that disrespect should be tolerated. Ava broke down completely. Years of pain. Years of silence. Years of trying to earn approval that should never have required earning. All crashing down at once. Then Richard stepped toward her and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. The same way he had since she was little. The same way he always did. Ava. She looked up, crying openly now. Richard smiled. You were never the small one. In this room. The sentence shattered something inside her, because she finally believed it. For the first time, she finally believed it. Across the ballroom, Charles Blackwell sat down slowly, a defeated man. Not because he lost money, because he finally understood what his choices had cost. And unfortunately, for him, the night wasn't over, because one final decision remained, a decision worth billions, and it would change every life in the room. The silence inside the ballroom felt heavier than any speech. No one cared about the orchestra anymore. No one cared about the celebration. No one cared about the expensive wine, the crystal chandeliers, or the perfect image the Blackwell family had spent decades building. Because everything had changed, and everyone knew it. Charles Blackwell sat quietly at the end of the room, looking older than he had only an hour earlier. The confidence was gone. The authority was gone. Only regret remained. Ava stood beside her father, still trying to process everything she had learned. Her grandfather, the betrayal, Monroe Global, the truth. It felt unreal, like someone else's story. Yet for the first time in years, something inside her felt lighter. Not because her father was powerful, not because her father was powerful, because she finally understood that her value had never depended on other people's approval. Richard slowly closed the folder. The sound echoed through the ballroom. Then he looked toward the investors. I believe we're finished here. Several investors exchanged nervous glances. One of them finally spoke. Mr. Monroe. Richard turned. The man swallowed. What happens now? A faint smile appeared on Richard's face. The same thing that always happens. Silence. The truth catches up. The investor nodded slowly, because everyone understood what that meant. The merger was dead. The expansion was dead. The illusion was dead. And by tomorrow morning, the entire business world would know why. Across the room, Margaret Blackwell finally stepped forward. For the first time all evening, she looked uncertain, almost frightened. Ava. The younger woman turned. Margaret struggled to find words, something she clearly wasn't accustomed to. She stopped, tried again. I'm sorry. The room froze, because nobody had ever heard Margaret Blackwell apologize. Ever. Ava studied her quietly. 3 years of humiliation, 3 years of subtle insults, 3 years of feeling unwanted. And now, an apology. The old Ava would have accepted it immediately. The old Ava would have rushed to make everyone comfortable again. But she wasn't that woman anymore. Ava smiled politely, then spoke calmly. I believe you are. Margaret blinked. Ava continued. But some apologies arrive after the damage. The words weren't cruel. They were honest, and somehow honesty hurt more. Margaret lowered her eyes. For perhaps the first time in her life, she had no response. Nearby, Ethan watched everything. The guilt on his face was impossible to hide. Eventually, he approached, slowly, carefully, like someone walking toward a bridge he wasn't sure could still hold his weight. Ava. She turned. The room seemed to disappear. Only the two of them remained, the husband she loved, the man who had failed her, the man who never meant to hurt her, and somehow hurt her. Anyway, Ethan looked exhausted, broken, ashamed. I don't deserve another chance. His voice was barely audible. Ava said nothing, because they both knew he was right. Ethan nodded slowly. I kept telling myself I was protecting everyone. A painful laugh escaped him. But I was really protecting myself. Tears filled his eyes. My mother, my grandfather, the company, the reputation. He looked directly at her. I protected everything except you. The words shattered what little defense remained inside him. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Ethan reached into his pocket, slowly, and removed the Blackwell family signet ring, the symbol of future leadership, the symbol of power, the symbol he had spent his entire life chasing. He placed it carefully on the table. The room gasped. Charles looked up sharply. Ethan. But Ethan shook his head. No. For the first time all night, there was strength in his voice. Real strength. Not inherited. Earned. I spent my whole life trying to become the man my family wanted. His eyes drifted toward Ava, and forgot to become the man my wife deserved. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted, because every word mattered. Ethan took a deep breath, then turned toward his grandfather. I won't be CEO. The room exploded. What? Is he serious? Charles stared in disbelief. Ethan. But Ethan wasn't finished. If leading this company requires becoming what all of you became, he shook his head. I don't want it. The silence afterward felt endless, because for the first time in his life, Ethan had chosen courage over comfort. Unfortunately, some choices arrive too late. Ava felt tears filling her eyes not because she hated him, because she still loved him. And that made everything harder. Richard quietly stepped back, giving them space, giving them dignity. Ethan looked at Ava, hope and heartbreak mixed together. What happens now? Ava stared at him for a long moment, then gently placed a hand over her stomach, feeling her daughter move. A tiny reminder of the future, a future she needed to protect. Finally, she spoke. I don't know. It was the truth. She didn't know, not yet, because healing wasn't a decision, it was a journey. And some journeys couldn't be rushed. Ethan nodded. A single tear rolled down his cheek. Then he whispered, I'll spend the rest of my life wishing I'd been brave sooner. Ava believed him. The man standing before her wasn't evil, wasn't cruel, wasn't malicious. He was simply weak when strength mattered most. And weakness has consequences. Even when love is real. An hour later, the mansion stood almost empty. The investors were gone. The reporters were gone. The celebration was over. Outside, Christmas lights reflected across the harbor. The water moved quietly beneath the moonlight. Ava stood near the marina beside her father. The cold wind brushed gently against her face. For the first time, all evening, she felt peace. Richard stood beside her, hands in his coat pockets, watching the water. After several minutes, he finally smiled. Your mother would have been proud. Ava felt tears immediately. Her mother, the woman who taught kindness, the woman who taught dignity, the woman who never taught her to become small for anyone. I hope so. Richard nodded. She would. Silence settled comfortably between them. Then Ava looked across the harbor, toward the mansion, toward the life she had spent years trying to fit into, and suddenly realized something. She didn't need their approval. She never had. Not once. Not ever. Because worth isn't something other people give you, it's something you recognize inside yourself. The moment that realization arrived, everything changed. 3 years later, the front page of Forbes magazine featured a photograph of Ava Monroe, founder and CEO of Monroe Creative Foundation, one of the fastest growing education charities in America. Millions of children helped, thousands, thousands of scholarships awarded, countless lives changed. She had built something extraordinary, not from revenge, from purpose. The headline beneath her photo read, The Woman Who Turned Pain into Legacy. Meanwhile, Blackwell International still existed, smaller, weaker, surviving, but no longer untouchable. Charles had retired. Margaret rarely attended public events. And Ethan dedicated his life to rebuilding what he could, including himself. Sometimes he and Ava spoke, sometimes they didn't. Life wasn't a fairy tale. Not every ending required reconciliations. Sometimes growth itself became the ending, and sometimes that was enough. As Ava stood on the balcony of her New York office watching the sunrise over Manhattan, her young daughter ran into her arms. Loving, happy, free, everything Ava had once wished to feel. She held her tightly, then smiled toward the horizon, not because the people who hurt her had lost, but because she had finally stopped needing them to lose in order to win, and that was the greatest victory of all. Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to know what you would have done if you were standing in Ava's place that night. And if this story touched you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more powerful emotional stories.